Chapter 2, The Great Inversion, How Treasury Supplants the Federal Reserve. Bessent's Strategy, Fiscal Dominance, and Project Genesis as the New Monetary Engine by ICT. The most important macro development of the 2020 to 2030 cycle isn't inflation, interest rates, or debt levels. It is this. The United States is transitioning from a Federal Reserve dominant regime to a Treasury dominant regime. This is the core of Scott Bessent's framework, a blueprint in which monetary power, liquidity creation, and economic direction move out of the Fed's technocratic orbit and into the Treasury's political, fiscal, and strategic orbit. Project Genesis is the technological infrastructure that makes this transformation irreversible. This chapter explains why the shift is happening now, how the Treasury gains effective control over liquidity, the role Genesis plays as the new state capacity accelerator, what this means for markets, credit, and asset pricing. Why the Federal Reserve lost primacy. Since 2008, the Fed has relied on QE-ZIRP forward guidance, bank reserves manipulation, short rate targeting to stabilize the system. But several structural failures broke the Fed's monopoly on macro management. 1. QT cannot run in a highly indebted system. Every attempt at QT ends with repo market stress, Treasury market dysfunction, liquidity shortfalls, collateral scarcity, unusual and exigent, Fed facilities. QT is now performative. It can never be permanent. 2. The Fed cannot control inflation without breaking the Treasury market. Raising rates reduces inflation but increases interest expense, refinancing pressure, deficit blowouts, supply/demand mismatches in UST auctions. At approximately $35 trillion in debt, monetary tightening is a fiscal threat. The Treasury cannot allow this. 3. The Fed's models broke publicly. The 2024 to 2025 unemployment revision, 1.7 million jobs, revealed misreported labor conditions, faulty real-time data, overestimated inflation persistence, underestimated labor softness. This shattered the data-driven veneer of independence. 4. The Fed cannot run industrial policy. The Treasury can. America's economic future now depends on AI, semiconductors, quantum, biotech, critical materials, advanced manufacturing, fusion. These require fiscal tools, not monetary tools. 5. Politically, the public blames the Fed for inflation, and Washington needs a scapegoat. The path was set. Monetary power must move somewhere else. It moves to the Treasury. 2. The Treasury's ascendance, the Bessent Doctrine. Scott Bessent's framework is bold but logical. In the 2020s, the Treasury becomes the true center of economic management, with the Fed as an operational arm, not a policy-making authority. This happens through 5 mechanisms. 1. Fiscal dominance. Treasury spending drives economic outcomes. The Fed sterilizes around it. Industrial policy, tariff policy, defense plus national security directives, reshoring incentives, infrastructure build-out, subsidies for strategic technologies. Markets no longer react to Fed minutes. They react to Treasury issuance, Treasury buyback announcements, fiscal packages, industrial policy directives, White House economic orders. 2. The Treasury becomes the real liquidity provider. Through deficit spending, tax policy and auction schedules, cash balances, TGA, targeted subsidies, credit guarantees, direct transfers, state capacity spending via Genesis domains. The Fed influences liquidity. The Treasury creates it. 3. Treasury controls the most important asset in the world, USTS. Control the collateral, control the financial system. Treasuries are the base layer for global collateral. Repo markets depend on UST supply. U.S. banking system capitalization depends on UST values. Derivatives use USTS as margin backbone. Foreign central banks hold trillions of USTS. When the Treasury controls supply, maturity, and issuance strategy, it controls rates, liquidity, risk premiums, cross-asset valuations, not the Fed. 4. Treasury integration into national security. Treasury sanctions already weaponize at dollar settlement, cross-border payments, asset freezes, sovereign liquidity. Genesis now extends that power into the technological domain, AI-directed materials discovery, autonomous manufacturing, energy resilience, synthetic biology, semiconductor independence. Economic security equals national security. Treasury equals national security institution. 5. Treasury becomes the allocation engine of the AI economy. Genesis enables state-directed R&D, state-directed compute allocation, state-directed data integration, state-directed scientific acceleration. The Fed cannot allocate resources. The Treasury now can, at compute speed. This is the final brick in fiscal dominance. Third Project Genesis, the technological engine of Treasury dominance. Genesis is the most misunderstood executive order of the decade. Commentators framed it as a science initiative, a national lab upgrade, an AI research platform. But its true function is far more consequential. Genesis is the infrastructure the Treasury will use to run a 21st century AI-accelerated fiscal industrial state. It creates 1. A unified national compute platform, supercomputers plus secure cloud, capable of training scientific foundation models, energy models, materials models, biology models, defense simulation models. This improves state capacity and reduces private sector bottlenecks. 2. The largest integrated dataset in human history, centralized under DOE/Treasury alignment. Genesis unifies federal datasets across energy, health, defense, space, climate, materials, nuclear, manufacturing, agriculture. This is sovereign AI data power. 3. AI agents that can run autonomous research pipelines. This compresses years of R&D, weeks, months of testing, hours. The Treasury controls the scientific acceleration curve. 4. AI-directed production and manufacturing facilities. Automation becomes a policy instrument. This enables reshoring, supply chain sovereignty, energy dominance, semiconductor independence. Treasury power grows with each capability. 4. How Genesis and Bessent reshape liquidity. The old liquidity model, Fed cuts rates, QE buys bonds, markets rally. The new liquidity model, Treasury spending plus Genesis industrial policy plus Fed accommodation equals structural liquidity expansion. Genesis requires decade-scale capital flows, which means constant fiscal outlays, multi-year capital expenditure cycles, strategic subsidies, national-scale investment, stable low real yields, Treasury issuance shaped around capital needs. This forces the Fed into the passenger seat. The Fed cannot run tight monetary policy while Genesis needs capital. The Fed cannot maintain high real rates while Treasury issues trillions. The Fed cannot prioritize CPI over national security R&D. Liquidity is now a fiscal instrument, not a monetary instrument. V markets in the Treasury Genesis regime. In this new regime, the Treasury determines the direction of liquidity. Genesis determines the direction of growth. The Fed manages plumbing and optics. The implications are enormous. Bond markets follow issuance patterns, not Fed projections. Equities follow fiscal industrial flows, not EPS revisions. AI, energy, semiconductors, defense become permanent bid sectors. Cyclicality becomes dominated by fiscal cycles. Liquidity shocks are resolved through fiscal levers, not monetary levers. BTC becomes a liquidity barometer, not a risk asset. Markets become policy assets, not discounted cash flow assets. 6. The narrative architecture protecting Treasury power. The White House framed Genesis as a Manhattan Project, a national AI mobilization, a scientific renaissance, a competitiveness initiative, a national security imperative. These narratives accomplish 3 goals. Make large fiscal spending politically unquestionable. Justify permanent Treasury liquidity programs. Define the Fed as a technical tool, not a policymaker. This is why the narrative matters. To shift monetary power, you must shift the story about who saves the nation. Genesis gives Treasury the hero story. 7. The irreversible nature of the new regime. Once the U.S. government builds national AI supercomputers, integrates federal datasets, automates scientific discovery, ties industrial policy to AI, commits multi-decade spending to strategic tech, retools the economy around compute, plus energy, plus materials, relies on fiscal spending to support those commitments, then the Fed can never again be the primary macro authority. The Treasury becomes the allocator, the architect, the liquidity engine, the capital conductor, the economic mission command. Genesis is the state capacity amplifier. Bessent is the strategist. The Fed is the custodian of plumbing. This is the new macro regime. 8. The Chapter 2 Summary. 1. The Fed has lost control because its tools no longer match national needs. 2. The Treasury is ascending through fiscal dominance plus strategic industrial mandates. Third Project Genesis is the technological and data backbone of this new regime. 4. Liquidity cycles are now driven by Treasury actions, not the FOMC calendar. 5. Asset markets have become fiscal industrial policy instruments. 6. The new macro order is permanent, not cyclical. Next up, Chapter 3. Chapter 3. The Genesis Mission, the birth of the fiscal AI industrial state. How Project Genesis becomes the operating system of Treasury dominance. Project Genesis is being sold as a science initiative, an innovation accelerator, a national AI platform, the mechanisms of fiscal liquidity creation. How TGA issuance, tariffs, and subsidies become new monetary tools. How Genesis creates decade-long liquidity requirements. And where the next asset booms originate. AI, energy, materials, BTC, defense. ICT. If you find this research useful, I'd be grateful if you considered subscribing. Your support directly helps fund deeper modeling and thoughtful breakdowns of emerging digital asset structures like this one. Subscriptions genuinely make this work possible. and sincerely appreciated. I released Chapter 2 of my macro thesis yesterday. As luck would have it, Scott Bessent did an interview later that day. Here is a breakdown of the speech and confirmation that indeed ICT may know what he is talking about. As Richard Duncan said, timing is everything. Bessent's interview confirms it. The 75-year era of Fed independence is ending. Treasury is openly preparing to rewrite the 1951 Accord, and Bessent's words prove it. For months I've argued that the United States is entering a Treasury-dominant macro regime, a structural shift where monetary power returns to its historical home, the Treasury, not the Federal Reserve. Today's Bessent interview didn't just support that thesis, it validated it outright, but to understand how monumental this is, you have to see Bessent's comments in the context of U.S. monetary history. Because what he's doing, and how he's speaking, has only happened 3 times in the last 75 years, and each time it preceded a generational shift in monetary governance. 1. There is a near-total taboo against Treasury secretaries publicly criticizing the Fed. In 75 years, it has happened only 3 times before Bessent. One 1960s, Treasury versus the Fed during Vietnam Great Society spending. Result, the Fed becomes increasingly subordinate to fiscal needs, culminating in early forms of yield control. 2. The 1970s, Treasury pressures the Burns Fed. Result, structural inflation, loss of Fed credibility, and eventually Paul Volcker's revolution. 3. 2008 to 2010, Treasury and Congress lean on the Bernanke Fed. Result, the birth of QE, the end of market-based money, and the dawn of financial repression. In each case, Treasury pressure signaled the existing monetary regime was failing. It presaged a major institutional reset. It ended with the Fed losing independence or being forced to realign to fiscal needs. Now, for the first time in over a decade, and only the 4th time in 75 years, a Treasury Secretary is directly and publicly attacking the Federal Reserve's structure, governance, and independence. That Treasury Secretary is Scott Bessent, and he's doing it on purpose. 2. Bessent is attacking the Fed's structure, not its policy. That is the tell. Most political figures criticize rates, inflation, unemployment, timing. Bessent is criticizing the Fed's governance, its decentralization, regional presidents, its independence, its institutional design, its distance from democratic accountability. This is the most important distinction. When a Treasury Secretary critiques the Fed's policies, the regime holds. When a Treasury Secretary critiques the Fed's structure, the regime is ending. And Bessent just did exactly that. 3. Bessent's residency requirement proposal is not administrative. It is an opening shot against the 1951 Accord. In the interview, Bessent said, regional Fed presidents should be required to live in their districts for at least 3 years, and the Fed board should veto any candidate who doesn't. This sounds boring. It is anything but. Why? Because the 1951 Treasury Fed Accord was built on decentralization, specifically to prevent political capture. Bessent's proposal centralizes authority in Washington, allows the board, which the Treasury influences, to override local selection, weakens the autonomy of the 12 district banks, erodes the structural backbone of Fed independence. This is the first technical step required to reverse the 1951 Accord. the agreement that separated the Fed from the Treasury and ended World War II-era yield curve control. Bessent is signaling the opposite direction, remerging fiscal and monetary authority, putting Treasury back in charge of the yield curve, reconstructing a 1940s-style coordinated regime under the cover of residency. This is how institutional takeovers always begin. 4. The institutional review is the second shot, a preamble to rewriting the Fed's mandate. Bessent didn't just criticize the Fed. He said, the institution needs a top-to-bottom review. This is not rhetorical. A top-to-bottom review means mandate evaluation, operational structure, governance, independence, accountability framework, regional versus federal power balance, how interest rates are set, how liquidity is determined, how Treasury operations and Fed operations interface. This is the exact language used before replacing FDIC leadership in 1933, the Fed's role in 1942, the Accord itself in 1951, Fannie, Chuck Freddie, nationalization in 2008. This language always precedes a regime shift. Bessent has now invoked it. 5. Bessent is controlling the Fed chair's succession, the single most decisive lever in the new regime. Treasury is now vetting candidates, shaping the shortlist, delivering names to the president, influencing ideological alignment, ensuring the next chair is Treasury compatible. This alone would be enough to shift the regime. But paired with public attacks on the Fed, it becomes undeniable. Treasury is choosing the next central bank leadership to serve Treasury, not restrain it. That's the functional end of the Accord. 6. When you connect all this to the AI industrial decade, the motive becomes clear. The United States is entering the most capital-intensive decade since World War II. AI supercomputing, domestic semiconductor fabrication, nuclear energy expansion, data center mega infrastructure, supply chain reshoring, defense modernization, national dataset unification, Project Genesis. This requires trillions in long-term financing, suppressed yields, controlled volatility, guaranteed liquidity, strategic capital direction, fiscal-monetary synchronization. None of that is possible under an independent Fed, market-driven rates, a hard inflation target, the post-1951 Accord regime. But all of it is possible under Treasury dominance, a unified fiscal monetary regime, a re-engineered yield curve, a federal industrial strategy backed by forced liquidity. This is why Bessent has begun attacking the Fed, not as an adversary, as a successor. 7. The Treasury dominance thesis, now fully validated. Bessent's interview confirms every pillar of the thesis. Treasury is undermining the Fed's structural independence. Rarely ever done, always meaningful. Treasury is asserting authority over regional banks. First step in centralizing control. Treasury is pushing an institutional review of the Fed. Precursor to rewriting mandate/structure. Treasury is selecting the next Fed chair. Capturing the Fed from the top down. Treasury is preparing to coordinate fiscal and monetary policy. A formal return to pre-1951 dynamics. Treasury is positioning itself to control long-term yields, ending the era of market-determined rates. Treasury needs full spectrum control to finance the AI industrial revolution. The core purpose of this entire regime shift. This is not speculation. This is happening in real time. And Bessent just publicly revealed the blueprint. Conclusion: the 1951 Accord is being rewritten in slow motion. For 75 years, the Fed has been independent. That era is ending, not abruptly, but methodically, with public criticism, governance changes, mandate reviews, appointment control, structural reshaping, and strategic necessity, all converging toward one outcome. Monetary power is returning to the Treasury. The Accord is dissolving. A new unified macro regime is emerging. Bessent told you that today, if you were listening. ICT,